When James finds an unusual hotel receipt in his wife Emma's belongings, his seemingly stable world begins to unravel. Suspicion leads him down a path of discovery, where secrets about Emma's infidelity and their strained marriage come to light. As tension builds, James is forced to confront his deepest fears and insecurities, while Emma struggles with her own guilt and the consequences of her actions. Their journey takes unexpected turns, testing the limits of love, trust, and forgiveness. Can they overcome the betrayal and rebuild what was lost? Or will their marriage crumble under the weight of the truth? The neighborhood was the kind that felt like a photograph from a long-lost family album. Neatly trimmed lawns, symmetrical rows of homes, and just enough variation in architecture to make it feel personal. It was here, in the heart of a quiet, leafy suburb, that James and Emma built their life together. They had met in college, two ambitious souls studying business administration, and had fallen into an easy rhythm that carried them through the years. James had always been the grounded one. His calm demeanor and penchant for solving problems made him a natural fit for his career in logistics management. Emma, on the other hand, was a firecracker, sharp, driven, and endlessly charming. She had a knack for connecting with people, a skill that made her an excellent marketing consultant. Together, they were a team. At least, that's how James had always seen it. Their home was a testament to their shared dreams. A 3-bedroom house with a small garden out back, where Emma had tried, and mostly failed, to grow herbs. It was cozy, lived in, and filled with little touches that spoke to their history together. A bookshelf they'd built one rainy weekend, photos from their travels, and the creaky recliner James insisted on keeping, much to Emma's chagrin. It wasn't perfect, of course. No relationship was James sometimes worked late, losing himself in spreadsheets and shipping schedules, while Emma's job often took her on the road for days at a time. But they made it work, or so James thought. One Wednesday afternoon, James was sorting through the mail bills. Junk flyers and a postcard from an old college friend made their usual appearance. But what caught his eye was a glossy hotel envelope addressed to Emma. It was unusual. Emma didn't typically leave her mail unopened. She liked things neat and orderly, and that included her inboxes, both digital and physical. Curiosity got the better of him, and he carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a receipt from a boutique hotel in the city, the Langston. The date stood out immediately. It was from last Thursday, a night Emma had told him she was attending a networking event. He frowned, glancing over the details. The bill wasn't extravagant, just a standard room charge and a couple of items from the minibar. Still, it didn't add up. James set the receipt aside, telling himself there was probably a reasonable explanation. Maybe the networking event had run late, and she decided it was safer to stay in the city. That sounded like something Emma would do. Practical, sensible. But a small voice in the back of his mind whispered otherwise. Over dinner that evening, he casually asked about her trip. Emma, ever poised, smiled and recounted the usual anecdotes, industry gossip, an amusing mishap involving a spilled drink, and how she'd impressed a client with her quick thinking. James nodded, feeling both reassured and unsettled. If there was anything more to her story, she wasn't letting it slip. The days passed, but the receipt stayed with him. It wasn't just the receipt, though it was the little things. Emma had been more guarded lately, spending long hours on her laptop in their spare room. The door often closed. She'd always been busy, but now there was a distance between them that James couldn't quite put into words. On Saturday, while Emma was out running errands, James found himself standing in front of the door to her office. It was ajar, and he could see her laptop resting on the desk. A part of him hesitated. He trusted Emma, or at least he had always wanted to, but trust and curiosity can be uneasy companions. He stepped inside and gently opened the laptop. The screen lit up, revealing a series of emails. Most were mundane, work-related, but one thread caught his attention. It was a chain of messages between Emma and someone named Alex. The subject line read, "Thursday night." James's chest tightened as he scrolled. The messages weren't overtly romantic, but they had a tone that didn't sit well with him. They were familiar, playful Alex, thanked Emma for a great night, and mentioned how much they enjoyed her company. Emma's replies were equally warm. James closed the laptop and sat back, his thoughts racing. Who was Alex, a colleague, a friend, or something more? He tried to push the questions away, but they lingered, gnawing at him. When Emma returned home later that afternoon, James couldn't bring himself to confront her. Not yet. He needed more clarity, more proof. He felt guilty for snooping, but the seed of doubt had been planted, and it was beginning to grow. The following week, Emma had another trip planned, this time for a client meeting in the neighboring city. As she packed, James tried to read her, looking for any signs of guilt or deception, but she seemed her usual self, focused, efficient, and a little exasperated at having to travel again. After she left, James decided to follow his instincts. He called the boutique hotel, posing as Emma's assistant. The receptionist was polite and helpful, confirming that Emma had indeed stayed there the previous Thursday. James thanked her and hung up, his stomach sinking. What now? He had the hotel stay, the emails, and a gut feeling that refused to be ignored. But was it enough to accuse her? And if he did, what would that mean for their life together? The following days were a blur. James kept himself busy, but his mind was never far from Emma. He replayed their conversations, their moments together, searching for signs he might have missed. He thought about their years of marriage, the plans they'd made, and the life they'd built. Was it all a lie? When Emma returned from her trip, James couldn't hold back any longer. As she unpacked, he brought up the receipt. Her reaction was immediate, a flicker of surprise, followed by a quick explanation. She'd booked the room to rest before an early meeting, she said. It was no big deal. Her tone was breezy, dismissive, but James noticed the way she avoided his gaze. He wanted to believe her, to accept her explanation and move on, but the doubts wouldn't let him. That night, as Emma slept beside him, James stared at the ceiling, wondering how much more of the truth lay hidden just beyond his reach. James couldn't shake the feeling that the surface of his marriage was beginning to crack. The explanation Emma gave him about the hotel stay lingered in his mind, replaying over and over like a song stuck on repeat. It wasn't just the details of her story. It was how easily she delivered them, as if she had prepared for the question long before he asked. Something didn't sit right, and the growing distance between them made him feel like a stranger in his own home. He decided to test the waters, subtly probing her for more information. Over breakfast one morning, he brought up her client meetings. You must be exhausted, traveling so much. Did everything go smoothly last week? Emma smiled, pouring her coffee. It was fine. You know how these things go? Lots of talking, some progress, and plenty of boring paperwork. She laughed lightly, her tone breezy, but her eyes didn't quite meet his. James nodded, pretending to be satisfied with her answer. He'd learned enough about human behavior to notice when someone was withholding Emma wasn't lying outright, but she wasn't telling the whole truth either. Later that week, James decided to confide in his best friend, Mark. They'd been close since their college days, and if there was anyone who could offer perspective, it was him. Sitting in a corner booth at their favorite pub, James laid out everything, the receipt, the emails, and his growing suspicions. Mark listened carefully, sipping his beer. Look, man, he said finally, it could be nothing. Maybe she really did just need a place to stay, but if you're feeling this unsettled, you need to find out for sure. Don't just sit on this. James frowned, stirring his drink. How I don't want to confront her without more proof. It feels wrong. Mark leaned forward, lowering his voice. Then don't confront her. Watch, pay attention, people slip up when they think no one's watching. James wasn't entirely comfortable with the idea, but he knew Mark had a point. Trust was a foundation, and right now, his felt shaky at best. If he was going to salvage his marriage, or at least understand what was happening, he needed answers. The opportunity came sooner than expected. Emma mentioned an upcoming business trip, this time a 2-day conference out of town. She packed her suitcase with her usual efficiency, chatting casually about the agenda and her excitement about networking. James played along, but the tension in his chest grew with every word she spoke. When Emma left the house, James waited a full hour before grabbing his keys. He'd decided to follow her, a decision that felt both necessary and invasive. The drive was uneventful, and James kept a safe distance as Emma's car navigated the highway. His heart pounded when she exited earlier than expected, pulling into a small cafe parking lot. James parked across the street, watching as Emma got out of her car. She wasn't alone. A tall man in a charcoal suit approached her, his smile easy and familiar. Emma greeted him with a hug. Longer than what James would consider professional, they stepped inside the cafe together, and James felt his stomach drop. He stayed in the car, torn between storming in and sitting quietly. After about an hour, they emerged, laughing about something James couldn't hear. The man placed a hand on Emma's lower back as they walked to their cars. The gesture was subtle but intimate. James gripped the steering wheel, his thoughts racing. Emma drove to the conference hotel as planned, checking in without incident. James, feeling more confused than ever, returned home. The image of her with the man played in his mind like a loop, each detail feeding his suspicions. Who was he? A client? A colleague, or something more? That night, James barely slept. He needed to know more but wasn't sure how far he was willing to go. The thought of hiring a private investigator crossed his mind, but it felt too extreme. Instead, he decided to focus on the details, the little things that might tell a bigger story. The next morning, while Emma was still at the conference, James started digging. He checked their joint accounts, scrolling through transactions that seemed ordinary at first. Groceries, utilities and subscriptions, nothing out of place. But then he spotted a recurring payment to a company called JS Events. Curious, he looked it up. The name led him to an event planning service that specialized in discreet getaways and private gatherings. His chest tightened as he clicked through their website. The glossy photos and vague descriptions hinted at exclusivity, privacy, and a touch of luxury. It didn't feel like something Emma would typically indulge in, but then again, he was starting to wonder how well he knew her anymore. James printed the bank statements and set them aside. He needed more context, more proof, before he could confront Emma. The thought of their marriage crumbling made him feel sick, but the not knowing was worse. When Emma returned from her trip, she was in high spirits, recounting the highlights of the conference over dinner. James nodded along, asking just enough questions to keep the conversation going. But he couldn't shake the image of her with the man at the cafe, or the questions about JS Events. The tension between them grew in the days that followed. Emma seemed more guarded, spending longer hours in her office and taking more calls outside the house. James tried to act normal, but he knew she could sense his unease. Finally, one evening, James decided he couldn't wait any longer. He placed the printed bank statements on the dining table and waited for Emma to come downstairs. "What's this?" she asked, picking up the papers. James took a deep breath. "I need to know, Emma. What's going on? Who's Alex? And what are these payments to JS Events?" Emma's expression shifted. Shock, then anger. "Are you spying on me?" she snapped. "I wouldn't have to if you were honest with me," James shot back. "Just tell me the truth." Emma hesitated, her hands trembling slightly as she set the papers down. "It's not what you think," she said finally, her voice quieter. Alex is a colleague. We've been working on a project together and sometimes we grab dinner or a drink to unwind. That's all. And the hotel? James pressed. The payments? Emma sighed, running a hand through her hair. The hotel was for a client meeting that ran late. The payments? They're for networking events. Exclusive ones I didn't tell you because I knew you'd overthink it. James wanted to believe her, but her answers felt too rehearsed, too convenient. He stared at her, searching for any sign of the woman he'd once trusted implicitly. I want to believe you, he said finally. But right now, I don't know if I can. Emma looked hurt, but she didn't argue. Instead, she stood, her shoulders tense. I don't know what else to tell you, James. If you don't trust me, that's your issue, not mine. She walked away, leaving James alone at the table, the bank statements still sitting between them. He felt a hollow ache in his chest, knowing their relationship would never be the same. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories. Share your thoughts. What would you do if you were in James's shoes? Emma's abrupt departure from the dinner table marked a shift in their relationship. For James, it wasn't just about the words exchanged. It was the distance growing between them, the way she chose deflection over reassurance. He couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was happening, something that might soon unravel the life they had built together. The following morning, James awoke to find Emma already gone. She had left a note on the counter. Early meeting, see you tonight. Don't wait up. Her handwriting, usually so precise, was rushed, almost careless. It wasn't like her, but then again, nothing felt normal anymore. James decided it was time to take matters into his own hands. He contacted Mark, who immediately offered to help. They spent the afternoon piecing together what little information James had. The receipts, the emails, the payments to JS events. Mark suggested something James hadn't considered, tracking Emma's movements. At first, James balked at the idea, but the nagging doubts pushed him to agree. By the end of the day, James had installed a discreet GPS tracker on Emma's car. He hated how far he was going, but he needed clarity. As he drove home, he tried to justify his actions, telling himself that if Emma was innocent, he'd feel relief, and if not, he'd have the truth. That night, Emma returned home late, her demeanor calm but distant. She didn't offer much in the way of conversation, and James didn't press her. Instead, he acted normal, keeping his plan to himself. The next few days passed in a tense routine. Emma went about her work as usual, while James monitored her movements. Most of the locations she visited were unsurprising: offices, coffee shops, the occasional client dinner. But then, one Friday evening, the tracker pinged an unfamiliar address, a private residence on the outskirts of the city. James's heart raced as he stared at the map. It wasn't a hotel or a restaurant. It was someone's home. He debated his next move, torn between confronting Emma outright and seeing for himself. In the end, his curiosity won. He grabbed his keys and drove to the address. When he arrived, he parked a safe distance away and watched Emma's car was there, parked in the driveway next to another vehicle, a sleek black sedan. The house itself was modern, with large windows that revealed glimpses of the people inside. James spotted Emma almost immediately. She was sitting on a couch, laughing with the man from the cafe, the same man who had hugged her. James clenched his fists, his breath shallow. He stayed for over an hour, watching as the two of them talked, laughed, and shared what seemed to be an intimate connection. Finally, he saw them embrace, this time longer, more deliberate. It was the confirmation he didn't want, but had been dreading. When Emma returned home that night, James confronted her. His voice was steady, but his words carried the weight of his anger and hurt. "Who is he, Emma?" Emma froze, her face a mixture of shock and guilt. What are you talking about? I saw you tonight at his house. Don't lie to me. Her defenses crumbled almost instantly. James, it's not what you think. Then tell me what it is, he demanded. Emma sat down, her hands trembling. His name is Alex. He's a colleague. But it's more than that. We've been working together for months and things just happened. I didn't plan for this. James felt like the ground had shifted beneath him. So, you've been cheating on me after everything we've built? Emma's eyes filled with tears. It wasn't supposed to be like this. I didn't mean to hurt you. Her words only made him angrier. You didn't mean to hurt me. You lied to me, Emma. You lied every time you walked through that door and pretended nothing was wrong. I didn't know how to stop, she admitted, her voice breaking. It's complicated. No, James snapped. It's simple. You chose him over us. The argument spiraled, both of them hurling accusations and truths they'd kept buried for years. By the end of it, James felt drained, his love for Emma buried beneath layers of betrayal and resentment. That night, they slept in separate rooms. James stared at the ceiling, replaying every moment of their relationship, searching for signs he might have missed. Emma's betrayal felt like a wound that would never heal, and he wasn't sure if he even wanted it to. In the days that followed, James threw himself into work, trying to distract himself from the chaos at home. Emma moved out temporarily, staying with a friend while they figured out what to do next. The silence in the house was deafening, a constant reminder of everything that had been lost. One evening, Mark came over with a bottle of whiskey. You're not going to fix this by isolating yourself, he said bluntly. Talk to her. Get closure at least. James shook his head. What's the point? She made her choice. And now you need to make yours, Mark countered. But running away from the problem won't solve anything. Reluctantly, James agreed to meet with Emma. They arranged to talk at a neutral location, a quiet park where they'd often gone on family picnics. When Emma arrived, she looked tired, as though the weight of her actions had finally caught up with her. I'm sorry, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I know that doesn't fix anything, but I need you to know how much I regret what I did. James nodded, his expression unreadable. Why, Emma? Why wasn't I enough? Tears streamed down her face. It wasn't about you. It was me. I felt lost, disconnected, Alex. He made me feel alive again. Her words stung, but they also gave James a strange sense of clarity. He realized that their marriage had been struggling long before Alex entered the picture. The long hours, the unspoken frustrations, the emotional distance. They had both contributed to the cracks in their foundation. I don't know if we can fix this, James said finally, but I need time to figure out what's next. Emma nodded, her face full of sorrow. Take all the time you need. I'll respect whatever decision you make. As she walked away, James felt a mixture of sadness and relief. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in weeks, he felt a glimmer of hope. Not for their marriage, but for his own future. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories. Share your thoughts. What would you do in James's situation? The days after their conversation at the park were heavy with uncertainty. James found himself caught between anger and nostalgia, replaying moments from their marriage that now felt tainted. Each memory was a double-edged sword, cutting deep as he tried to reconcile the love they once shared with the betrayal that had shattered it. Emma, staying with her friend, reached out sparingly, respecting James's request for space. Still, her absence was palpable. Their home, once alive with shared routines and quiet companionship, felt more like an empty shell. Even little things, her favorite coffee mug left on the counter, the faint scent of her perfume lingering in the hallway, reminded him of what they'd lost. James tried to throw himself into work, but focus was elusive. The confrontation with Emma had brought some clarity, but it had also left him with more questions. Was her affair a symptom of a larger problem, or simply a choice she made without considering the consequences? Could he forgive her? Or was their marriage beyond repair? Mark, ever the voice of reason, suggested therapy. "If nothing else, it'll help you make sense of this mess," he said one evening over drinks. "You don't have to figure it all out on your own." James was skeptical at first, but after some thought, he decided it couldn't hurt. He reached out to a local therapist, Dr. Claire Reynolds, and scheduled an appointment. Their first session was awkward. James wasn't used to baring his soul to a stranger, but Dr. Reynolds had a way of making him feel heard without judgment. During one session, she asked a question that stopped him cold. "What do you want, James? Not for Emma or anyone else. For yourself." He didn't have an answer. For so long, his identity had been tied to his role as a husband and partner. Now, with that foundation crumbling, he wasn't sure who he was or what he wanted. Meanwhile, Emma wasn't idle. She, too, had started therapy, seeking to understand her own actions and their consequences. She sent James a letter, not an email or text, but a handwritten note, pouring her heart onto the page. She didn't ask for forgiveness, only a chance to talk, to truly listen to each other without the walls they'd both built over the years. James hesitated before reading it, unsure if he was ready to face her words. But curiosity won out. And as he read, he felt a mix of emotions: anger, sadness, and a faint glimmer of hope. Emma admitted to feeling lost in their marriage, consumed by her work, and disconnected from the life they'd built together. She didn't excuse her affair but framed it as a wake-up call. A painful, misguided attempt to fill a void she hadn't even realized was there. The letter left James conflicted. He could see the cracks in their relationship that Emma described, but her betrayal still loomed large. Forgiveness felt like an impossible mountain to climb, yet the thought of letting go entirely left him hollow. The tension between them came to a head during a mediation session suggested by Dr. Reynolds. It was the first time they'd been in the same room since their argument, and the air was thick with unspoken words. James sat stiffly in his chair, his arms crossed, while Emma fidgeted with her hands, her eyes darting between him and the mediator. "I just want to understand," James said finally, his voice low but steady. "Why, Alex? Why now?" Emma hesitated, her cheeks flushing. "It wasn't about him, James. It was about me. I felt invisible, like I was just going through the motions. He noticed me in a way I hadn't felt in years." Her words hit James like a punch to the gut. "And you think I didn't notice you?" he shot back. "I worked late. I planned trips. I did everything I could to support you, and you repay me by sneaking around." "I'm not saying you didn't care," Emma said softly, "but we stopped really seeing each other, James. Somewhere along the way, we lost us." The mediator intervened, steering the conversation toward their shared history and what they valued in their relationship. It was painful, dredging up memories of happier times, but it also reminded them of why they'd chosen each other in the first place. As the weeks passed, their sessions became a regular fixture, forcing them to confront their feelings and communicate in ways they hadn't in years. There were no quick fixes, no easy answers, just the slow, difficult work of untangling the threads of love and betrayal that bound them together. One evening, after a particularly raw session, Emma asked James if he'd be willing to have dinner together, not as a couple, but as two people trying to find common ground. He agreed, though the prospect made his stomach churn. They chose a small, quiet restaurant, far from the places they used to frequent, to avoid the weight of old memories. Over the course of the meal, they talked, not about the affair, but about their lives, their dreams, and the people they'd become. For the first time in months, James felt a flicker of connection, like a faint ember in the ashes of their relationship. But the dinner wasn't without its challenges. At one point, Emma mentioned Alex, not by name, but in passing. And James tensed. "Do you still see him?" he asked, his voice tight. "No," Emma said firmly. "I ended things completely." James searched her face for any sign of deceit, but found none. Her honesty was both reassuring and unsettling. It left him with no one to blame but the two of them. Their path forward remained uncertain. But one thing was clear. The love they once shared wasn't enough to guarantee a future together. It would take time, effort, and an unflinching willingness to confront their flaws, both individually and as a couple. In the end, James and Emma agreed to a trial separation, giving each other the space to heal and grow. It wasn't a definitive ending, but a necessary pause, a chance to redefine themselves and their relationship, for better or worse. As James packed a bag and prepared to move into a small apartment nearby, he felt a bittersweet mix of relief and sadness. This wasn't the life he'd envisioned, but it was the life he had now. And for the first time in months, he felt a sliver of peace. Not because everything was resolved, but because he was finally taking steps toward clarity. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to my channel for more stories that make us think, feel, and reflect on the complexities of life. What would you do if you were in James's shoes? Share your thoughts below. James's life during the trial separation was a mix of rediscovery and uncertainty. Moving into the small apartment, he was struck by the stark contrast between his old life and this new, quieter existence. The walls were bare, the furniture minimal, and the silence deafening. Yet, in that emptiness, he found a chance to reflect, to confront the lingering pain without distraction. Emma, too, was navigating her own challenges. Living with a friend, she was forced to examine the choices that had led her here. She dove deeper into therapy, unearthing the fears and insecurities she'd buried beneath years of professional success and a facade of control. The sessions were grueling, but Emma was determined to face herself, even if it hurt. For weeks, James and Emma maintained a careful distance, communicating only when necessary. But one night, as James was unpacking a box of old photos, he stumbled across an album from their early years together. The pictures were filled with laughter, spontaneous adventures, and the kind of joy that felt foreign now. One photo in particular stood out. A candid shot of Emma laughing so hard she was doubled over, tears streaming down her face. James smiled despite himself, the memory tugging at something deep inside him. The next morning, James made a decision. He reached out to Emma, suggesting they meet, not to rehash their problems, but to talk honestly about where they were and what they wanted. She agreed, her tone cautious, but hopeful. They chose a neutral spot, a quiet cafe they'd never visited before. When Emma walked in, James noticed how different she looked, more vulnerable, almost fragile, but also more open. She sat down, and for a moment, they simply stared at each other, unsure of where to begin. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," James said finally, breaking the silence. "About us, about everything that happened." "So have I," Emma replied, her voice steady but soft. "I know I hurt you, James, and I know sorry doesn't fix it." "It doesn't," he admitted, "but it's a start." For the next hour, they talked openly, sharing feelings they'd both kept bottled up for years. Emma admitted to feeling trapped by her own expectations, constantly striving for perfection, but never feeling good enough. James confessed that his tendency to retreat into work had been a coping mechanism, a way to avoid dealing with the growing distance between them. "I think we both lost ourselves along the way," Emma said, her eyes glistening. "And in losing ourselves, we lost each other." James nodded, the weight of her words settling over him. "Maybe we did, but the question is, can we find our way back?" Their conversation didn't resolve everything, but it was a turning point. For the first time, they were both honest, not just with each other, but with themselves. They agreed to continue therapy, both individually and together, to see if they could rebuild what had been broken. But as they began this tentative new chapter, life threw them an unexpected curveball. Emma received an offer for a major promotion, one that would require her to move to another city. It was the kind of opportunity she'd dreamed of, but the timing couldn't have been worse. When she told James, he was conflicted. Part of him wanted to support her, to encourage her to chase her dreams. But another part feared that this move would be the final nail in the coffin of their relationship. "What are you going to do?" James asked, his voice carefully neutral. "I don't know," Emma admitted. "I want this, but I also want us to work, and I don't know if I can have both." The promotion became a symbol of their larger struggle, a choice between their individual ambitions and their shared history. Emma wrestled with the decision, weighing the potential for career fulfillment against the fragile hope of reconciliation. James, meanwhile, grappled with his own feelings, unsure if he could trust her again, let alone support such a significant change. Their next therapy session was tense. The air thick with unspoken fears, Dr. Reynolds guided them through their emotions, encouraging them to focus on what they truly valued and what they were willing to fight for. "If we're going to do this," James said, his voice firm, "we need to be all in. No half measures, no secrets. If you take the promotion, it has to be with a plan for us, not just you." Emma nodded, her expression serious. "Agreed. But that means you have to meet me halfway, James. I can't rebuild this alone." For the first time in months, they found themselves on the same page. They began to sketch out a plan, how they would maintain their connection despite the distance, how they would balance their individual needs with their shared goals. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't guaranteed to work, but it was a start. The decision to move forward wasn't just about logistics, it was about trust. James had to trust that Emma was committed to their future, and Emma had to trust that James wouldn't hold her past mistakes against her forever. It was a delicate balance, one that required constant effort and communication. As Emma prepared for the move, they spent their remaining time together, rebuilding their bond. They revisited old haunts, reminiscing about the life they'd built while imagining the one they hoped to create. Slowly but surely, the cracks in their relationship began to mend, though the scars would always remain. On the day of Emma's departure, James helped her load the last of her boxes into the car. They stood in the driveway, the weight of the moment pressing down on them. "This isn't goodbye," Emma said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "No," James agreed. "It's a new beginning." They embraced, holding on a little longer than necessary, as if anchoring themselves to the hope they'd fought so hard to find. As Emma drove away, James watched until her car disappeared from view, his heart heavy but resolute. In the weeks that followed, they settled into their new reality. Phone calls and video chats became their lifeline, bridging the miles between them. It wasn't easy. There were still arguments, moments of doubt, and the ever-present fear of failure. But there were also moments of connection, of laughter and shared dreams, that reminded them why they were fighting for this. James knew their story was far from over. The road ahead would be long and uncertain, filled with challenges they couldn't yet imagine. But for the first time in a long time, he felt hope, not just for their relationship, but for the people they were becoming. And sometimes, hope was enough. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to my channel for more stories like this one. What do you think? Would you fight for a second chance, or would you walk away? Share your thoughts below. As Emma settled into her new city, the cracks in her relationship with James continued to test their resolve. While their video calls and late-night texts bridged the physical distance, the emotional chasm was harder to navigate. Both were struggling, caught between their longing for each other and the weight of everything that had transpired. One Friday evening, James received a call from Emma. Her voice carried a mix of excitement and nervous energy. "I've been invited to a gala next week," she said. "It's a networking event, but it's a big deal, I thought. Maybe you could come." The invitation caught James off guard. It had been months since they'd spent any meaningful time together, and the idea of reuniting in a formal setting felt daunting. Still, he could hear the hope in her voice, and something inside him told him to say yes. "Okay," he replied after a pause. "I'll be there." The week leading up to the gala was a whirlwind. James wrestled with his doubts, questioning whether he was ready to face Emma in person again. Meanwhile, Emma threw herself into preparations, determined to make the evening perfect. For both of them, the event felt like a test, a chance to see if their fragile bond could survive under pressure. When the night of the gala arrived, James drove to the city with a mix of anticipation and dread. As he pulled up to the venue, a grand hotel illuminated by glittering lights, he took a deep breath and stepped out of the car. Inside, the room was buzzing with conversation, the air filled with the clinking of glasses and soft strains of classical music. And then, he saw her. Emma stood near the center of the room, dressed in a sleek black gown that caught the light with every movement. She looked radiant, her smile bright but tinged with nervousness as their eyes met. James felt a pang of longing, a reminder of the connection they once shared. "Hey," she said softly as he approached. "Hey," he replied, his voice warm but cautious. They stood there for a moment, the noise of the room fading into the background. Finally, Emma broke the silence. "Thank you for coming. It means a lot." James nodded. "I figured it was time." As the evening unfolded, they navigated the unfamiliar territory of being together again. Emma introduced James to her colleagues, and he watched as she charmed the room with her wit and confidence. For a moment, he was reminded of the woman he'd fallen in love with, the woman who could light up a room with her presence. But the night wasn't without its challenges. As they sipped their drinks and made small talk, James couldn't help but notice the subtle glances exchanged between Emma and a man across the room. The man was polished, confident, and clearly interested in her. James's stomach tightened, the old insecurities bubbling to the surface. "Who's that?" he asked, trying to keep his tone casual. Emma followed his gaze and sighed. "That's Richard. He's a senior partner at the firm. He's been persistent." James raised an eyebrow. "Persistent how?" Emma hesitated, then looked him in the eye. "He's asked me out a few times, but I've made it clear I'm not interested." James nodded, his jaw tight. He wanted to believe her, but the weight of their history made it hard. The tension between them was palpable, a reminder of the fragile trust they were trying to rebuild. Later in the evening, James found himself alone on the balcony, the cool night air a welcome relief from the noise inside. He stared out at the city lights, his thoughts a whirlwind of doubt and hope. Moments later, Emma joined him, her expression soft but serious. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice tentative. "I don't know," James admitted. "This is harder than I thought it would be." Emma stepped closer, her eyes searching his. "I know I've made mistakes, James, and I know it's going to take time for us to find our way, but I want this. I want us. I just need to know if you feel the same." James looked at her, his emotions raw. "I do, but I'm scared." Emma's scared that we're just setting ourselves up to get hurt again. Her eyes glistened with tears. "I'm scared too, but I'm willing to fight for us, if you are." For the first time in months, James allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could find their way back to each other. He reached for her hand, their fingers intertwining as they stood together under the night sky. The gala marked a turning point. But the road ahead was still fraught with challenges. Over the next few weeks, James and Emma worked tirelessly to rebuild their relationship. They scheduled regular visits, alternating between their two cities, and committed to open, honest communication. There were setbacks, of course, moments of doubt and frustration that tested their resolve, but they refused to give up. One evening, during a quiet dinner at Emma's apartment, she surprised James with a question. "What if I move back?" James blinked, caught off guard. "Back to our old place?" Emma nodded. "I've been thinking about it. The promotion is great, but it's not everything. And I'm realizing that what I want most is to be with you." James felt a surge of emotion, relief, gratitude, and a flicker of hope. "Are you sure I don't want you to regret it?" Emma reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. "I'm sure this is where I want to be." Her decision to move back was a bold step, a declaration of her commitment to their future. Together, they began to rebuild not just their relationship, but their lives. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't perfect, but it was real, a testament to their resilience and the power of second chances. As they unpacked boxes in their home, laughter filled the air, a reminder of the joy they'd fought so hard to rediscover. And though their journey was far from over, James and Emma knew one thing for certain. They were stronger together than they were apart. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to my channel for more stories that inspire and challenge us. Would you fight for love like James and Emma, or would you let go? Share your thoughts below. The weeks following Emma's decision to return home marked the beginning of a new chapter. Not just for her and James as a couple, but for each of them individually. Moving back wasn't a magic solution. It was a commitment, a declaration that they were ready to confront the past and build a different future. James watched as Emma unpacked her belongings with care, her movements thoughtful and deliberate. It wasn't lost on him that she was putting as much effort into this physical process as she was into their relationship. They spent those first few days reorganizing the house, creating spaces that reflected their new reality, rather than clinging to the one they'd left behind. Their first evening back under the same roof felt strange but comforting. They cooked dinner together, something they hadn't done in years, and sat at the dining table talking about everything and nothing. The simplicity of it felt like a balm to old wounds. In the days that followed, they continued their therapy sessions. Both as individuals and as a couple, Emma worked to unpack the emotional disconnection that had led her down the path of infidelity, while James explored the ways he had unknowingly withdrawn from their partnership. The sessions weren't easy. Some ended in tears, others in silence, but they were necessary. One of the most significant breakthroughs came during a joint session, where James opened up about something he had never voiced before. "I felt like I wasn't enough," he admitted, his voice heavy with vulnerability. "When I saw you with Alex, it wasn't just betrayal I felt, it was inadequacy, like I wasn't worth fighting for." Emma's eyes filled with tears. "You've always been enough, James. My actions weren't about you. They were about me not knowing how to cope with my own unhappiness. But that doesn't excuse what I did, and I'll spend the rest of my life proving to you that you're worth everything to me." The honesty in that moment shifted something between them. It didn't erase the pain, but it laid the groundwork for forgiveness. Not just for Emma's actions, but for the ways they had both failed each other. They began setting new boundaries and routines to ensure their relationship stayed on solid ground. Weekly date nights became non-negotiable, even if it was just a walk around the neighborhood or a shared cup of coffee on the porch. They also committed to keeping their lines of communication open, no matter how difficult the conversation. For James, the greatest challenge was learning to trust Emma again. He knew trust wasn't something that could be rebuilt overnight, but each day brought small moments that reinforced his faith in her commitment, whether it was her transparency about her work schedule or the way she consistently prioritized their time together. Emma, on the other hand, faced the ongoing task of forgiving herself. She worked tirelessly to demonstrate her dedication to their marriage, but she also had to confront the lingering guilt that threatened to overshadow her progress. Through therapy and her own self-reflection, she began to understand that forgiveness wasn't about erasing the past. It was about finding peace within it. Their daughters, initially hesitant about their parents' reconciliation, slowly began to come around Linda, ever the pragmatic one, offered her cautious support, while Lucy, more emotional, expressed her relief that her family wasn't falling apart. A family dinner one Sunday evening brought laughter back into their home, a sound James hadn't realized how much he missed. The true test of their progress came months later, when Emma received another offer from her company, this time for a position that would allow her to stay local while still advancing her career. It was a dream opportunity, one that felt like the culmination of all her hard work. When she told James, his reaction surprised even himself. "I'm proud of you," he said, smiling. "You've earned this." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything they'd been through. In that moment, James realized he wasn't just proud of Emma's professional success. He was proud of the person she'd become, the work she'd done to rebuild their relationship, and the courage she'd shown in facing her flaws. The day Emma officially accepted the position, they celebrated with dinner at the same cafe where they'd first started to mend their bond. Sitting across from each other, they shared a toast, not just to the promotion, but to the life they were rebuilding together. As the months turned into years, James and Emma's relationship evolved into something stronger and more honest than it had ever been. They continued to face challenges, of course, but they did so as partners, united by the lessons they'd learned and the love they'd fought to preserve. Their story wasn't a fairy tale. It was real, messy, and imperfect. But it was theirs, and that made it worth every tear, every argument, and every step toward healing. In the end, James and Emma didn't just save their marriage, they transformed it. And in doing so, they discovered that sometimes, the hardest battles lead to the most meaningful victories. Thank you for following along with this journey. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to my channel for more powerful stories that remind us of the resilience of the human spirit. What do you think? Is love worth fighting for, even after betrayal? Let me know in the comments below.